Ilse Köhler-Rollefson and Prerna Singh Bindra in conversation with Paro Anand for Camel Karma. Can we please give them a loud round of applause? Thank you.
Hi, thank you for making the trek to Sabha. Can you hear? No. Hello? That's better, yeah. Which means I don't have my hands free anymore. So thank you for making the trek all the way to Samvad in its new avatar. And we are the first session to start here. So just to introduce the speakers first, Ilse Köhler-Rollefson is the author of Camel Karma, and this is Camel Karma. And I can tell you it's a wonderful book. She has spent more than 20 years amongst India's camel nomads. And after 27 years, she feels more at home in Rajasthan than in her native Germany. A vet by training, she writes about human-animal relationships and is a passionate advocate for the rights of pastoral people. So there's a real bridging of the animals and people, especially those who work with animals and live with animals. And Prerna Singh Bindra has been in the forefront of the battle to conserve India's wildlife for over a decade. She was a member of India's National Board for Wildlife and its core standing committee. She has also served on Uttarakhand State Board for Wildlife. Prerna's primary focus is protecting wildlife habitats and critically endangered species. She's widely published with more than 1,500 pieces on nature and wildlife on various platforms. Prerna's book, The Vanishing, India's Wildlife Crisis, which is that book, also an amazing book, published by Penguin, was released last year. And it was listed amongst the most important must-read books of 2017 by Mint. Her other release this year is a gorgeously illustrated, this one's my favorite, a book for children called, delightful title, When I Grow Up, I Want to Be a Tiger. It was published, it won the Publishing Next Industry Award for Children's Book of the Year 2017. She is currently a visiting fellow at UNESCO Category 2 Center, Wildlife Institute of India, and as part of this, Prerna is co-editing an anthology of World Heritage Sites in South and Central Asia. She was conferred the ABN AMRO Sanctuary Asia Wildlife Service Award and the Carl Zeiss Wildlife Conservation Award for Excellence in networking and engaging the public at large for the cause of wildlife conservation. She was honored as an Ashoka Changemaker with the Ashoka Foundation's listing her as one of the world's most influential and inspiring women. So it's really been, it's really been worth your trek. This session is going to be amazing. And she is currently, that's another aspect, also guest faculty for a module on popular writing and conservation policy at the National Center for Biological Sciences, Bangalore. So we have two wonderful speakers here today, and I'm going to just start with the, you know, when you hear the words animal, human, you immediately think the next word that comes to you is conflict. Animal, human, conflict. What I really was so happy when I was reading Ilse's book, Camel Karma, is she keeps using the word animal-human interaction rather than conflict. And I think that's a really good starting point. But let's start right at the very beginning with both the speakers. My first reaction when I saw Ilse's book was, what? Someone really spent 20 years with camel herders and lived with camels, and then to know that the person who undertook this adventure was from Germany, a country which doesn't even have camels. So for both of you, my question is, where did this fascination, or rather an obsession, because I think it has to be an obsession, where did it come from? And you have to start from the very beginning, which we know is a very good place to start. Why the obsession and where did it come from?
Actually, is it on?
Yeah.
I can't help it. You see, I love animals, and that's the reason why I studied veterinary medicine in Germany. But once I had graduated as a veterinarian, I felt I really couldn't identify with that profession because it was all about economics. You know, either you treat small animals, then it's mostly like owner psychology. You have to treat the owner rather than the animal. Or you work with farm animals, and that really, you know, the farm animals, they've gone away, they're gone towards industrialized livestock keeping. And that was just, when I graduated, this was just emerging, that trend, that livestock were turned into machines, basically. You know, they were just there to produce. And, you know, you go to a farm and it's not about, you know, helping the animal, it's about helping the farmer, you know, make a living.
And keeping the animal economically viable or gone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So then I left the veterinary profession and tried to do, I knew I had to do something different with my life. I went to Jordan on an archaeological excavation, and there I saw this wonderful herd of camels, you know, passing by every day. There were about 100 camels, and they were wonderfully behaved. You know, they had a herder there, and he was talking to them, and they were doing exactly as he was telling them. You know, they were drinking, you know, from a small rivulet, and they were really well behaved, you know, going down there. And so that's where I fell in love with camels. And then, after a while, I had a fellowship to come to India and work on camel socioeconomics. And I was initially at the Camel Research Center in Bikaner. But I couldn't really get to see the camels in, you know, and their people. You know, it was really difficult at that time. And then a young veterinarian from the Raika community, he invited me to a veterinary hospital in Sadri. And he took me and he said, I'll show you the real people who take care of the camel. And so this is about 27 years ago. I came to this village called Latada, and this was the scene that was awaiting me there, you know. And I was so amazed, you know, seeing there was a herder, a Raika family, and they had, you know, about 20 camels parked in their courtyard, and they were lying down there, and they were so peaceful, and the small toddlers were, you know, walking around those camels, and, you know, nobody was afraid of each other. There was total positive karma between, you know, the camels and their owners. And that impressed me, you know, and that's the kind of relationship we need to have with our animals. And India can lead the way in that. You know, India is really special. So I just can't help it. I have to keep doing it.
And that's such a beautiful photograph. It's such a tender photograph. And Prerna, what about you? Your obsession and the start of it?
Yeah, this one. Thanks so much for that really kind introduction. And it's such a privilege. She hasn't introduced herself, but her books are such an incredible body of work. And they're not, you know, they push the borders of what we think of as children's books. So I'm very privileged to be here. Before I get into how it all began, and I'll read a paragraph from my book for that, I would like to just give a small story about my Camel Karma. When I was told I was doing this session, I was a little taken aback because while I love animals, I haven't really had anything to do with camels for a very long time, but I was told, you'll handle it. So I said, okay. But it made me think about actually, one of the first, it was a story of, I've had a Camel Karma movement. And it actually decided my path for me, or actually showed, okay, this is the way you're going to go. Okay. You know, when I was a child, maybe in 10th, 11th, I can't recall. And those were the days when there were no mobiles and no communes of communication besides, you know, talking, and you used to have those landlines. And we got a call saying that my friend had an accident in a car. She was in a car and she had an accident. And So we asked, what's kya hua, kaise, what is the accident? And they said it was with a camel cart.
Oh.
And my first reaction was, how's the camel? I didn't ask about my friend, I didn't ask about her family. I said, oh my God, how's the camel? And everybody was taken aback, especially it was my friend's mother who was calling and she thought I would be distraught. I said, no, all of you are looking after her. But no one would have thought about the camel. And that was a kind of path I followed always. When there were snakes which turned up at our house, I was always worried that the snakes be fine and be left free to go and not have, you know, not kill it, not place it anywhere. And my mother used to say, you're more worried about the snake. I said, yeah, always.
Always.
So I've had my camel moment. And where I started, as I said, I love animals. I have a background of management, but I like to read the first para of my book, which actually again set the path which I'm on today. So I was about in second standard in a city called Jamnagar, and I'll just read it. My penchant for vanishing into the wilderness goes a long way back. I would have been about 8 when I failed to alight from the school bus at St. Anne's Convent, Jamnagar, Gujarat, causing the city police to swing into action. More so, as my father was the superintendent of the police of the district. It was my mother, and they do know their children, who eventually found me well camouflaged behind the bougainvillea in the riotous backyard of her bungalow. Her tears of relief and pent-up anger were met with an indignant, but the peahen has laid eggs. I'm waiting for the chicks to come out. Was maths, I implied, more important than this momentous event? Apparently it was, though I still maintain it wasn't, but that's a debate that we'll reserve for later. So yeah, it's always been animals first for me.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty shy by nature. You know, you write, right? And you don't speak. That's not, I don't think but to me, I'm speaking for animals. Yeah. And I think what moved me was, one was my love for animals and the fact that we were losing it. We were losing nature, you know. The trees in our backyard, the forest that I used to go to and where I saw my first wolf was cut up to be mined. There's a cement mine there now, the sanctuary is almost gone. The nalas that were there are now so polluted. And there is a silence that surrounds it. You know, we don't talk about it. We don't admit the fact that we're losing nature. Yeah? And that sense of injustice, you know, and therefore I write with that very idealistic aim of, you know, that you'll make a difference. Yeah? So I think that kind of...
But especially as women, and especially in the kind of work that you do, you come up, you sort of, not even come up, you crash into policy that is on the opposite side of where you stand and where those who you speak for stand. And especially for women, this is a very lonely road at the best of times. How do you negotiate that? How difficult has it been? And I mean, I ask because I started off wanting to do something with animals and anything with animals, whether it was offering to look after Romulus Whittaker's snake and crocodile farm in Madras, what was then Madras, or writing to the Maharani of Alwar and saying, I'll come and look after your kennels and dogs, or writing to the zoo director and saying, I'll do guided tours for children here. Nobody offered me a job at all, and so I went into writing. So it's really for me a privilege and a sort of my own karma having come back to this session. But the reason why I had to step back was because it was a road, a path, which was so thorny and so difficult, and I felt as a young woman, I couldn't do it, but you pressed on, both of you. So what are some of the difficulties you've come up against, and how have you dealt with them?
Can we have the next slide, please? Well, you're talking about policy. The next one, please. Yeah, policy is very important, and it's the key to survival of the camel and the key to the survival of the people who take care of the camel, and without whom the camel will also not survive. And it's been a long road, more than 20 years, and the camel, in the meantime, it has become a state animal, partly maybe because of our advocacy efforts. But on this slide here, you see the community. They are called Raika. They are the traditional caretakers of the camel, and they believe their first ancestor was made by god Shiva to take care of the first camel that Parvati had made out of clay. And that camel then caused a lot of nuisance, so she asked Shivji to give her a man to take care of the camel, and then Shivji took some of his sweat and skin and shaped the first Raika out of that. So because the Raika have this history, or this mythological origin, so they believe that it's their responsibility that the camel is doing well. And when I first came, they were already having a lot of problems. There were disease outbreaks among the camels. A lot of camels were dying, and when they heard I'm a veterinarian, they all thought I could help them. And I couldn't. By that time, I'd already lost all my veterinary skills, and I was totally out of that field. But I started to collect money from my friends in Germany to buy the medicines for these camels, and then we started a distribution effort, and then one thing led to another. We set up 2 NGOs, one in Rajasthan, the Lockheed Pashupalak Sanstan, and one in Germany, the League for Pastoral Peoples, which works at the global level to support pastoralist cultures. And we got from from animal health care into the grazing rights. Can we have the next slide, please? Because the camels, actually, they depend on access to the forest. And the forest policy is such that livestock is to be kept out of it, although the camels are actually kind of part of the total ecosystem. So if they don't have the grazing rights, if they don't have the access to the forest, they cannot survive. So we worked on that issue. We took that to the Supreme Court. And I mean, there was just never any opportunity to stop, because the next challenge was arising. And actually, the latest challenge now is that the fact that the camel has become state animal. There are all kinds of regulations and prohibitions on using the camel. You can't take it out of Rajasthan. It can't be used for meat. You can't put in the nose peg. You can't castrate it. So basically, the camel has lost its value, because it's not used anymore for transportation. That market is gone from Pushkar. So already in 2001, we actually became aware that camels were sold for slaughter from Pushkar. And we, the Raika community, their leaders, and our organization, we tried to get attention for that. We wrote dozens of letters to the government, and it wasn't really, no attention was paid to it, nothing really happened. And then the situation actually got even worse with the camel becoming state animal and a particular law being put into place. So at the moment, the only thing you can do with the camel is actually milk it. So this is actually, can we have the next slide, please?
But that's so odd. You would think that making it a state animal would be a step in the right direction for its protection, but instead.
Yeah. So there are a few Raika who are still using camels when they go on long-distance migration from Rajasthan to Madhya Pradesh.
Right.
So they transport all their belongings on camelback. And that also, they need to get a permission from the government to take the camels out of Rajasthan. And when they come back to Rajasthan, they have to have the same number of camels and, prove that none of them disappeared. Like, there's a lot of bureaucracy involved. Next, please.
It's really odd how sometimes policy goes in the wrong direction that you had expected.
Yeah. And this picture actually, it shows, the traditional health treatments they were giving. They had an enormous body of knowledge about how to use the local plants in treating camel diseases. And they are much, much better than any trained veterinarians. I would absolutely say that.
And the treatments are specific to camels?
They're specific to camels. Okay. They have their whole, disease terminology, and they have different treatments for sheep and for goats and for cattle and so on. So they are really the traditional veterinarians. Wow. And can I go on
yes,
a little bit?
Yes, please.
Next, please. Next photo. Yeah, so this shows you, the close, intimate relationship between camels and their herders. And if you go into a herd of female camels, you just stand there, and they come up, and they greet you, they take their nose and they give you a little kiss, they are so friendly, these animals.
Really?
And it's the Indian camels that are so friendly, it's not all over the world. It's a question of culture, because these Raika, they have such respect and such love for their animals, so that also changes the nature of the camels. Next, please.
I've been actually quite frightened of camels, and reading your book and looking at the slides has made me...
Next, please.
Just change, yeah.
So this is actually the product of the future, if the camel milk can save Rajasthan's camels, and it can do a lot also for people with diseases. We have found out that demand for camel milk is especially among autistic children. Many autistic children, they drink just a little bit of camel milk and they change their behavior. They establish eye contact, they sleep better. So we have...
You have mentioned in your book an instance of a child who was autistic.
There are many instances, actually. It's not just one. I mean,
and you witnessed the change. It's
actually, that's not yet in the book, because this actually happened after the book was published in 2014.
Okay.
But things have moved on since the book was written. Next, please. And the important thing about the camel milk is the fact that the camels are actually, according to traditional knowledge, eating 36 different plants. And all of these plants are used in traditional medicine. They all have some pharmaceutical value. So all the goodness of these plants actually gets filtered into that milk. And that's one of the reasons why it's so healthy. And I think if, camel milk comes from an industrial system, where the camels are stall-fed and given GM, feed or so, then the situation will be totally different. So it's important, if we want to save the camel, we have to save the whole ecosystem. We need to keep that traditional system in place, and that's actually, this is our, what's keeping us busy at the moment.
The Raika drink the milk, but they don't actually sell it, is that right?
They used not to sell it. There was a traditional custom, selling camel milk is like selling your children. So they were totally against it. Yeah, when I first came, they said, no way, we're not selling. It's to be given away free. But they have realized now, they are desperate to sell their milk. So I'm really happy that in Jaipur now, it's going to be started again, camel milk sales. And from the government side, and we are also selling our camel milk now from the Raikas that we work with.
And there's a photograph in your book of camel milk ice cream being sold.
Yeah.
What does it taste like? You'd want to know that, right? What does that camel milk taste like?
The camel milk taste, it depends very much on what the camels eat,
Right.
If it eats neem tree, it becomes kind of bitter and salty. And if it eats other trees like kedri or so, then it becomes really sweet, actually. It's not at all salty. So the taste totally reflects on the vegetation that the camels eat.
Yeah.
And this is so important, The camel is actually, globally, it's not a threatened species. Globally, the camel population is increasing. As you can see, the upper graph shows how the camel population globally increases, but in Rajasthan, it's going down like that. And that's actually a reflection of the camel not being used properly. In other countries, the camel is used in many ways. Also in Africa, there's global warming, so cattle keeping people actually switching to camels in order to survive global warming. And there is also in Europe and in America, there's big interest now in the camel milk. Camel farms are being set up in the US and in Europe to supply that demand for camel milk. not just for autistic children, but also for diabetes patients.
Oh.
So it works against a variety of diseases, even skin diseases. Now, and this picture is from a camel yatra we undertook in 2005 through all of Rajasthan in order to draw attention. We were trying to get the attention of the government, you know, to do something. It has to take action in order to save the camel and the culture. Next, please. Yeah, and this is our brand ambassador with Camel Milk in his hand. So, and next, was that the last one, maybe?
Okay, that is really very interesting because it's also a reflection on how policy and government policy can down the road impact something in really an opposite way. I'm sure when the animal was made the state animal and the camel became the state animal, it was thought that it was going to be something beneficial to the camel and the herders, but instead it's worked in the opposite way. And then, you know, getting that policy, as you're saying, raising awareness and then having to reverse that perhaps becomes doubly challenging. So, Prerna, you've been part of policy making on, yeah.
So you asked me two questions essentially, policy as well as being a woman in this.
Right.
It's a very lonely path. I will second and third that. It's not just, I'll come to the woman bit later, but it's not just about being a woman. It is that when you take on something like wildlife conservation, you speak in a different language. You're not, you're very isolated socially. Because, you know, when people are talking GDP and growth rate and development and there's a new road and you're wondering which forest is this road going to go to, and, you know, so your outlook is always very different, which is not really in sync with what most. So it's a different space that you occupy that I find. Women, we have a lot of women in wildlife conservation increasingly, but I found that the policy space, which is strange because a lot of work is also at the very remote areas and fields. We have a lot of women there, which used not to be the case earlier. And it's difficult. I've gone to very, very remote forests alone. And I have, but even when I'm in a forest alone where there are tigers and elephants and animals you would think are potentially dangerous, I've always been scared of men, not of animals. If you find the wrong man in a remote area, heaven help you. But that said, Gurgaon is far more, where I unfortunately stay, is far more unsafe than, say, a remote forest in Jharkhand. Yeah, so, but, so in the National Board for Wildlife, I used to be, we had these meetings once in 3 months. It is an apex body for policy making in India for wildlife conservation. And it has this really difficult task of regulating activities in and around protected areas. So if you have Ranthambore Tiger Reserve, which I guess most of you know, and if you want to mine inside or you want to cut one single tree, you have to come to this board for permission. So it's usually assumed that you're a rubber stamp and you'll put your stamp and everything will be allowed if it's an industry or whatever. And you generally try and say, no, this is critical for wildlife. And the one lesson which I write about in my book that I learned is that it does not figure anywhere in our priority list. It doesn't, it's not that it's the bottom of the priority list. It doesn't exist. Policies are, it's actually a whole discussion in itself, and I'm not going to bore you with it. But, you know, we don't, till I was part of that committee, we don't realize how important they are. We don't realize that how in these meetings or high-level meetings, we lose our sources of drinking water. The air that we breathe, that I breathe in Delhi, is so polluted because the government has made a policy that construction industry will be not have environment regulations anymore. Okay? We don't realize it, but it's happened. Even as Delhi is the most polluted city in the world. And we don't raise our voice, even when our children are taking in that air. So I think we need to be more involved. It was very difficult. You have to work 3 times as hard to be taken seriously because you're a woman. Because you're apparently, it was one place where I felt very young because everybody was far older than I was. And it was very nice to be the youngest member, but that meant that I had to be all that more, you know, look very serious and work very, very much harder. There was another question, women and policy. I think I kind of covered both.
So honestly, what I'm hearing is that, yes, sure.
I'm
sure,
so
sure,
sorry.
No, go
you
ahead.
mentioned state animal,
Right.
the camel, and this is where I get in policy. Rajasthan state bird, the great Indian bustard. It's Rajasthan state bird. It would have been a national bird, but for the fact that someone thought in bustard you might be, you know, somebody would write an A, inadvertently misspelled it, and it wouldn't be a bustard, but something we can't pronounce. And yes, and I wish it was a national bird, because there is some attention, however much it is, to that particular species. Rajasthan's great Indian bustard, we have fewer than 150. We say 150 in the wild in the world, most of them in Rajasthan, about 300 kilometers, 250 kilometers from here beyond Jaisalmer. Even as we speak, this bird is going extinct. It's nowhere in our policy. I've just, with the past 2 weeks, been struggling to bring that up with the army because much of it is in the army area, with renewable energy people, with the power ministry, because bustards, when they fly, they are heavy. They are the world's heaviest flying birds. They're very handsome bird. This is the one. It's here. I'm sorry, I don't have a slide. It's one of the world's heaviest flying birds. So what has happened is its grasslands have been destroyed, and renewable energy, I don't call it green energy, because even solar and wind energy takes up prime wildlife habitats, which soak in carbon, which sequester carbon, which contribute to fighting climate change. So these entire areas have been taken up by wind energy projects. And where there were bustards once, it's just roads and miles of wind farms. And what the birds, so one, they have lost their nesting habitat where they used to nest their ground laying, they lay their eggs on the nest, pretty much like the peafowl that I skipped school for to see. And when they fly, they get electrocuted because there is a mesh of wires. We lost 2 in December, the new year, you know, the cusp of the new year as well. And each bird means it's one step closer to extinction. It's pretty much gone. And I think it's very shameful that with a bird going extinct in our watch, how many of us even know it exists? Does the government care? It's so difficult when you talk with Ministry of Power. Are they up to you are against renewable energy also? But please, placement has to be seen. Where are the projects coming in? So it's a nightmare. Just trying to get any
Tough
message
roads,
across.
And almost what I'm hearing and what I read from your book, is that to an extent, both of you are on one side, and to an extent, both of you are on opposite sides. Because I know that herders are, with large animals which need to free grazing ground, are sort of an antithesis to wildlife conservationists, because of course they need, the camels need forest. The wildlife conservationists feel that this is a dangerous trend to let them into the forest. In your book, you had instances of where forests were closed off to camel herders, and so the camels really had no food left to eat, and therefore the Raika community also was on the brink of starvation and extreme penury because their camels were not being allowed to go into the forest and feed. So how do we create this balance? It's such a difficult question, and
I think
maybe you two can, I don't know, shake hands and tell us how to do it.
No, we'll be very happy to shake hands. No, I think we are in a way, I mean, you put it quite accurately. We're, on one hand, we're on the same side, the animal side. On the other hand, there is some conflict between the people who support pastors and the people who support wildlife. But I think
it's important to talk to each other.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And to understand each other. And I do care as much about wildlife as I do about camels. I still have the feeling there are more people who support wildlife than camels. But we need to, get together and interact. And I also have to say, that the pastoralists, the Raika, they go past my house every day, and there's a lot of leopards around, and it's regular that leopards, they eat sheep and goats and even small camels sometimes, but they don't mind, they don't take any action against the leopard or so, not at all. They say, that animal has just as much right to, is also hungry, he needs to eat. So there needs to be a dialogue, I think, how everything can be integrated. And I also want to tell you, in Germany, grazing by livestock is actually it's the most important nature conservation measure, because a lot of plants disappear if they are not being grazed on. And I think in India, even there are some cases, that's always mentioned in Bharatpur, when the buffaloes were kept out, the grass grew high, and then certain birds didn't nest anymore. And but it needs to be monitored, the interaction. I'm also totally against letting, all the livestock free in the forest.
Yeah.
People have to take responsibility for managing the forest. But at the moment, it's just the forest department that's doing it. It's not participatory, and that's where we need to get to.
Yeah. I just wanted to interject for a moment, Prerna, on an experience that I had. What we found was that the community called the Pardhis, who have traditionally been wildlife poachers and are nomadic people, so they move from forest to forest, poaching on animals for selling of bear parts and tiger parts and things. So the World Wildlife Fund started a project to try and bring Pardhi children into the education system and mainstream them, instead of letting them just continue. Because if we don't educate them, then they have no choice but to go into their parents' profession, which is poaching. So this project was started where there was a bridge course, and we were training the children. I was part of that project. We were training the children and then getting them placed into schools, which was also incredibly difficult, because no matter how bright and capable these children were, they were not being allowed into the schools, even under the Right to Education project, because they said that these are not our children, they don't belong to our town, our village, our state, because they're nomadic people, so they don't have a statehood. So it was a struggle. Now, but why did that project go underground is because wildlife conservationists felt that if we take the children away from the Pardhi families who are the poachers, it's going to make their poaching more effective and more efficient, because we've taken away the young kids who were kind of holding them up. So there was a lot of hue and cry by some very eminent conservationists saying, stop this project immediately. And I couldn't wrap my head around that. So just talking of that policy and unfortunately conflict.
So 3 threads here.
Yep.
So first the camel or livestock. So see, India has about 5% of its land as protected area. The world average is 10%. The ideal should be 50% is what we need if we are to continue to survive, because we must remember that whatever we do and whatever we are, look at where you're sitting, water, glass, wood, it is all derived from nature, right? So this is what scientists arrive at. Even this 5%, so even Pakistan and Nepal and Bhutan and all our neighboring countries have more, 10%, 17%, 40%. We are at 5%. Effectively, it would be about 2%, given that there are roads and mines and villages and townships and reservoirs and temples. And I could go on and on within this forest. So you can imagine the pressure on these forests. India has the largest livestock population in the world. Obviously, almost the largest people population also. It's very difficult if you have that kind of pressure. We have a forest here in Jaipur where there are leopards, Jhalna. There are no natural prey inside. No cheetal, nothing, and it's a very complicated story. But what will those, so if livestock goes in, it's because the livestock is going in. And one of the reasons, it's very complicated, but when livestock goes in, the natural prey of the species shrinks because there's competition. And, you know, when there is disturbance, the natural prey ceases to be because they don't feel safe, not just being hunted. They won't reproduce. It's, again, complicated, but I'm trying to put it as simply as possible. Then they will feed, the leopards or the tigers or the carnivores will feed on livestock, wolf or whatever. And therefore, that conflict that we speak about comes into force. So, I mean, in a very ideal world, we do need some areas where there isn't livestock. It's very, very difficult. And I will again like to read 3 paras from my book if that's possible. But before that, I'll answer your Padi question. So there are many hunting tribes in India. Padis, Karni in Madhya Pradesh, what are they? So there are a number of hunting tribes in India. In 1972, hunting was prohibited. Hunting continues as poaching, as illegally. There have been a number of programs to rehabilitate, and they still continue. Some programs have been stopped for various reasons. I have met, during the course of my career, a number of poachers from a number of communities and not communities. See, earlier, there was more forest, more wildlife, fewer people, fewer livestock. The hunting was for the pot, to meet your personal needs from a larger supply. Now, the hunting is commercial. Okay, it's not only sold in markets locally, it goes to China, it goes to UK, it goes to US, largely to the southeast, whether it be pangolin scales, whether it be ivory, whether it be whatever, tiger skins, whether it be birds, it's a global black market. So, you know, the economics of it has completely changed from being a, you know, cooking for the pot, which also continues. Many times when I speak to these tiger poachers, especially those who hunt, so they'll hunt anything. And, you know, if they get caught, they have the most, you know, the fanciest lawyers flying in from big cities like Delhi, Mumbai, because they are backed by traders. So the whole structure of it, earlier I know they used to do it for 2 bottles of liquor also. Okay, we've met people who, and they still do it, depending on, but the whole economics has changed. Younger people are going into it because it's easy money, it's an open bazaar. It's like a supermarket where which is manned by some, you know, very bare forest staff, which is not armed in most cases. So when I met one of these poachers, a lot of us talk about it, they don't want these alternate sources of income like embroidery and stitching and handicrafts. When you can kill a tiger, you know, it gives you a stature that I've killed a tiger. Education still continues. There have been some programs which have been stopped for a variety of reasons because they're very site-specific.
Right.
These things are very, and you know, a lot of research has gone into why a specific program needs to be stopped. Funding is also a problem. But there is, and there are, even in Rajasthan, there continues to be an education program for poachers, children of poachers. So it's very complex, very site-specific, very group-specific, and very complicated, again, like everything in life is. About our country, I would just like to say again, It's not about conflict. Conflict is man-made. When you see a leopard, if a leopard enters here, and it can, it's fine. It's actually fine. It will see all of you, and it will try and hide, and within 2 seconds, you won't know where it is. It's happened to me. I was sitting reading a book with my dog, and suddenly I saw this leopard. It was because my dog went still, and I had my hand on him. And the next second, I didn't know where the leopard was. And we didn't do a thing, and it went away. But if all of us start screaming and start pelting the leopard, that is when conflict happens. You know, there might be a snake here, but the minute you see it, it's conflict. So, you know, that's what it is. Is there time for a 2-minute read?
Yes, we have
Okay.
5 minutes. Okay.
Fine. Okay.
How long is
So
it?
India has one of, should I or no?
Yep.
India has one of the highest population densities globally at over 380 people per square kilometer and a greater diversity of carnivores than most countries, 58, and still largely manage to live as fellow residents. In this context, a visit to a remote hamlet in Jharkhand's Palamu Tiger Reserve taught me an important lesson. I was in Palamu in October 2010 as part of a team to assess the management of the reserve. Palamu is one of the poorest and driest districts of the region. This is in North India, in a state called Jharkhand. And Palamu has been ravaged by years of strife, being a region impacted by insurgency and left-wing extremism. One morning, a ranger, that's a forest officer, informed us that a leopard had killed a couple of cows in a tribal settlement on the edges of the park. When we reached the hamlet, there didn't seem to be anything out of the ordinary. The household had 5 cows and a few goats. They were corralled, but the fences weren't very secure. It was hot, and the family slept outside too. Sometime after midnight, the leopard had sneaked in and killed 2 calves. The loss was acute for a family living off the land and their cattle. Yet, in a manner peculiar and especial to my country, they were calmly philosophical about this loss. If you lived in the jungle, this was not unexpected. The forest gave them food, water, medicine, wood, fodder, everything. So occasionally, you had to pay up. Sort of like the tax that you pay the sarkar, the government, someone remarked with a wry laugh. And no, the leopards or the tigers do not kill people. You just had to give them right of way, respect their boundaries. Animals do not attack unprovoked. I was astounded. These warm, wonderful, wise people were abjectly poor, certainly in the way we define poverty. They did not have access to medical care. Their children walked some 3 kilometers to government school. And of course, they had no luxuries that we view as necessities. Cars or roads to zip around on, TV, air conditioners. They only had bulbs by solar electricity. Yet they seemed curiously content. The forest and the land provided, their children did not go hungry. I learned for these communities it wasn't tolerance. Wild animals were an intrinsic part of the landscape, ecologically, socially, culturally, and one lived and adjusted around them like people do, and live with, say, vehicles which are convenient, but have this nasty habit of running you over. Thank you.
Yeah. So that was a positive kind of thing, that there is, as you call, animal culture, that there, India traditionally has an animal culture, an inclusiveness, and we should be careful that we're not going to lose that. So I think we can just have a look at the clip. Yeah, the AV. And then we'll open up for questions.
You're quite right. In India, that's its treasure, the animal cultures, and it really must not lose it. Actually, it should guide the rest of the world in this respect, you know, to provide an alternative model to industrialized livestock keeping. You're going in the opposite direction, but see, that's why we have to keep working.
That's why we have to keep working.
Yep.
Yeah, let's see the.
Yeah. I think we can open up for questions now. Yes. Yes. Yeah. That was so moving.
Why don't you take this?
I enjoyed very much the presentation from the three speakers. My name is Wendy. I'm from Australia. So Ilse, you would be familiar with the fact that we actually have quite a large camel population in Australia. Until recently, they were threatened, mainly because they used to break down the fences of the large cattle companies we have in Australia. So again, that conflict with grazing and wild animals. But recently, I think, following examples perhaps from yourself and others, Australia now is moving to the industry of selling camel meat and milk. So again, it comes back to that issue that we have to find some sort of an economic value to be able to preserve something. I guess because of the consumer society we live in. So, yeah, and that again is looking at that, trying to get that balance between the wild animals and the herds. But I've also spent a lot of time in Indonesia, where they have quite a large problem also with wild animal trafficking, particularly of orangutans, but also birds and various other animals. The general consensus seems to be that a lot of animals, like the orangutan and various others in countries like Indonesia and Africa, could be all extinct within 20 to 30 years. A lot of that, I mean, it seems to be two issues. One is the prestige that the Chinese, the growing middle class in China, place on trafficking animals, and also in the traditional medicines. And yeah, just the threat from growing populations. So can I just get feedback from the two speakers regarding these issues as to what we can do? I guess in particular in response to that growing middle class demands from countries like China. Thank you.
To say something, yeah, yeah, it is worrying what's happening in China. Also, the very fastly industrializing. It's been to the detriment of a lot of small farmers, like the pigs, for instance. There used to be a big biodiversity of local pig breeds in China, kept by small farmers, eating just the waste, and those traditional systems have been replaced by, you know, some specialized genetics from Canada. You know, these are these pigs, they can't just eat waste, they need to be fed on grain and, you know, kept in a stable environment and all that. It's terrible for the ecology of the world, it really is. And India is actually lucky. I know there's that conflict with the wildlife, and I totally sympathize that, and we have to solve it. But in a way, I mean, this traditional herding system, just using the natural vegetation is much more sustainable. And yeah, it's sad. I don't know what to do about China, except raising their awareness. But going back to Australia, yes, that I've read a lot about the situation in Australia, and these are actually all camels from India and from Pakistan that were brought there in the middle, Afghanistan, yeah, that were brought there in the middle of the 19th century, yeah, and then to build the railway, and after they built the railway, the handlers, who also Pathans, they were told to shoot these camels because they hadn't any use anymore, and they didn't do that. They just let them grow, and it's such a perfect environment apparently for the camel in Australia. It's actually a great way of producing meat. You know, if you want to eat meat, this is wonderfully healthy meat in many ways, but it's not looked at as such. And it's not just the camel. You know, I've recently read even the kangaroo is the kangaroos are also exploding, the kangaroo population. So sorry, I have no solution.
So just because we don't have too much time, yes, illegal wildlife trade is huge. That's what we are in the age of the Anthropocene, where we are seeing the 6th extinction, right? We have lost half of our wildlife in the past 50 years. China is a huge consumer. That isn't the only problem. The fact is that the middle class, which we think which we are, I mean, our consumption, our footprint, the earth can't take it. So, you know, we have to think of every action. When we put on the light at home, I mean, where is that light coming from? From a power station, coal plant? What is it doing to the climate? Which forest is it in? What is it doing to the lungs of the local people? If we start thinking, I think we'll become conscious consumers.
So then your contribution of writing a children's book would be huge, because that's where you start to make the change in thinking is right at the, so an adult is unlikely to think when they switch on a switch, where is this coming from? But a child could be made to
and the child is the father of man. So
and the child is the father of man. But yes.
Yeah, my name is Dhruv, and I used to work on what the two of you might call conflict, but what I look at it as a conversation between the human animal and the non-human animal. So from what I understood, we've sort of seen animal identities over here, animal inclusion and exclusion, animals as commodities that are being circulated, and animals that generate conflict or controversy. I'm very interested in how the two of you would be engaging in a dialogue, because from a pastoralist point of view, we talk about human rights, we talk about grazing rights, we talk about the political ecology of grazing and that sort, and then we talk about animal geographies and wildlife conservation. How do you think we can bridge this, this rift over here?
That's the million-dollar question, and one I don't know.
No, I think there should be a little bit of negotiation. You know, everybody needs to see, you know, the livestock produces food, so that's also an important consideration. And the wildlife also has to exist. I mean, we need to, the resources are scarce, so I think we need a negotiated kind of a settlement, and then stick to that and keep monitoring it and maybe adapt it.
So there is national park. Very few, maybe less than 1% of India is national park, which is actually the only area which is off for grazers. Okay, it's the only area. There are buffers around each sanctuary, which are for livestock. Genuine. The problem is because they are gone. They have been, you know, grazed to the bone. Therefore, now you want the attention now, the focus now is to take the last of those national parks. I mean, that's unfortunately a reality. Because of the laws, those are the only places that remain. The rest are all over. So yes, we as I keep saying, there is room for negotiation. We have lost the common lands which was actually a very good system where you had common lands for pastoralists. Yeah, but we have, because they have all gone
Yes,
for
Mike,
industry, for infrastructure, for whatever, urbanization, blah, blah. We need to revive that. So there are a lot of things. It's a very complicated answer which cannot be answered in the next 10 minutes, 10 seconds. But dialogue is critical.
Yep, yep.
You have a question?
I think we have time for one last.
This one.
Just one last with the. Yeah.
Yeah, so my question is to Ilse Köhler. I understood that you're interested in increasing the production of camel milk for human consumption also. How will we ensure that it doesn't meet the same fate as the cow? Being pumped with hormones and steroids and all those sort of things.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, the time, since it's starting now, the time for that corrective measure may also be right now.
Yeah. No, it's very important that we project this as a different model, that we don't fall in the traps and follow the cow model. And so we need to keep talking about it, and this was a good opportunity to do that. So I'm very grateful for that. We just need to keep up, you know, the pressure, and also the livestock scientists, I mean, they're the ones who promote these ideas about efficiency, etc. And efficiency, you know, is measured by the amount of food you give to the animal and then the amount of meat or eggs or so comes out of it. And that's a totally wrong approach. So,
but I think in terms of camels, it would probably be much more protected by the Raika because they have animal culture. So thank you so much for talking about not a human-animal conflict too much, but also on the positive aspects and the animal-human culture, which creates common grounds. Thank you to both the speakers. Thank you to the audience. Thank you.
I wish to thank our speakers, Ilse Köhler-Rollefson, Prerna Singh Bindra, and Paro Anand. Thank you very much. Our next session starts at 12:30, Ghatotkaach, Master of Illusions.